Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Science Pub, where for at least the foreseeable future, we are connecting the community virtually with the top minds at Oregon State University. My name is Nathan Moses, and as usual, I'll be hosting tonight's event from OSU-Cascades. We're going to be joined in very short order by a collection of experts to lead tonight's presentation, The Environment, How It Affects You and Your Health. Tonight's moderation will be conducted by the Director of Alumni Relations at OSU's College of Public Health and Human Sciences, Casey Farm. We'll go through full introductions of our all-star panelists in just a few minutes. But before we get to that, tonight's program will kick off with a moderated presentation and discussion, but that's not all. We will have plenty of time for audience participation as we typically do. If you've not joined us before, participants may submit questions for our presenters via the YouTube live chats if you're logged in through YouTube, or via the Mentimeter app at www.menti.com. Just use event number 3597977. Again, that's 3597977. And that number is actually going to be down at the bottom of your screen tonight. But again, that's at menti.com. If your questions do not get a chance to get answered tonight in our limited time, definitely feel free to submit to events@osucascades.edu. So looking forward to your participation tonight. As actually in fall, we've had some fantastic questions come through and some great audience participation. So let's keep that rolling. Next up, we're going to do some special announcements and updates from OSU. The first one being is a big call out to Beaver Nation if you're interested in becoming an advocate for OSU. For 2020, Oregon State's two top priorities are the development of the OSU Arts and Education Complex and the continued expansion of the OSU-Cascades campus here in Bend. We'd love to have your help. Check out the beavercaucus.org for more information on how you can be a part of it. OSU's 39th annual Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. virtual keynote and award celebration will be held on Monday, January 18th. American political activist, philosopher, academic, and author Angela Davis will be the guest speaker. Make sure that you register for today. Those are open now. All right, well, let's get this show rolling. I'd like to officially welcome in Casey Farm, who will lead off our program with a panel introduction this evening. On behalf of the audience tonight, Casey, I'd like to thank you all and all of our panelists. Thank you so much for your time. And at this point, Casey, take it away, my friend.
Thanks, Nathan. Appreciate you having us tonight. And thanks to OSU Cascades for having the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences and the College of Public Health and Human Sciences for tonight's Science. So I really, really appreciate it. We got a full program, so I'm gonna get right to it. And first, I'd like to introduce the Dean and Professor from the College of Public Health and Human Sciences, Javier Nieto, who has a special message from the college. Javier, how are you doing this evening?
Thank you, Casey. Thank you, Nathan. I'm doing just well, and I hope everybody's enjoying the evening. Thanks for the introduction. I'm really excited to be here and participating in this session. So I'm the Dean of the, as Casey said, the Dean of the College of Public Health and Human Sciences at Oregon State University. We, in our field of public health, think of health as well-being, as wellness, not merely the absence of disease. And when we look at the factors that affect our health and well-being, we often find that the upstream environmental factors are among the most important. So we know that the place where you live is key to your health. And that's why we say that your zip code is more important to your health than your genetic code. We also know that health of humans is intrinsically dependent on the health of the planet and the health of the society. At Oregon State, we talk about the three healthies as our areas of distinction: the health of the earth ecosystems, health of humans, and health of the society. We cannot address human health with ignoring the health of our planet and our society. And again, when we think of the health of the environment and the earth ecosystems, we think of climate change, and as a primary concern is its effects on access to water and food supply in vast regions of the world, the increasing frequency of heat waves and other natural disasters, and also because of potential effects on health, which remains to be fully understood. And that's why I'm so excited to, about this session, bringing together researchers from our environmental health program, along with our colleagues in the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy this session. Back to you, Casey.
Thanks, Javier. Appreciate it. And thanks for giving us a little bit of a rundown of the things that are going on with the College of Public Health and Human Sciences. At this point in time, I'd like to welcome in Roberta Marinelli, who is the Dean, and she's also a professor for the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences. Roberta, good evening to you. Thanks for joining with us.
Good evening to Casey and to all the rest of our panelists and to our audience. As Casey mentioned, I'm the Dean of the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences, which some people call Earth, Wind, and Fire. And we pursue a lot of research in the areas of basic and applied Earth system work. So we work on the land, the ocean, the atmosphere, and the interconnection of those with people. And while we work in the Pacific Northwest, we also work all over the planet. We work in polar regions, we work at the bottom of the ocean to the upper reaches of the atmosphere. And some of our faculty actually work, and they don't work on other planets, but they study on other planets. And embedded in all of that is a strong portfolio of experiential learning where we take our students out into the world and tell them how we do science and teach them how to do the same. And we're hopeful that they can take that work and that perspective and bring it to their own careers so that we can keep the knowledge transfer going and make our world more environmentally literate about how we interact with it and what it means for our future. We support a lot of large facilities that are important for environmental observing. So for example, we support the Oceans Observatory Initiative. We have a big system of arrays off our ocean that we can really sort of dial into or look on the web and get real-time data about what's going on all over our coastal ocean. We're building new research vessels for our oceanographic research fleet. We're building a wave energy test bed off Oregon to see if we can actually harness the energy of the ocean to generate renewable electricity for Oregon and beyond. But all of this is important because it's telling us about our environment. It's telling us about whether our ocean is functioning well, whether our air is healthy, whether the land is well taken care of. And all of these aspects, healthy air, healthy land, and healthy oceans are critical for healthy humans. And as we all understand far too well, the diseases that we're susceptible to are often environmentally born, generated, or transmitted. And so the message here, which we come at from a somewhat different perspective than Javier's group, is that environmental health is critical for human health. And we have to understand the environment to make sure that we're making the best of our human health. And tonight you're going to see some great examples of that. And back over to you, Casey.
Thanks, Roberta. Really appreciate it. Thanks to both of our deans for joining us this evening. They'll be back here in a little while when we get to the Q&A portion. So if you have questions for them, they'll be joining our three panelists. But I'd like to invite our three panelists to join me at this moment in time, George, Maria, and Perry. And let's start off right into the good stuff. Maria, tell us who you are, what you do, and how it ties into tonight's theme, the environment, how it affects you and your health. I'm really excited to have you guys here. We did this almost a year ago to the day, so it's nice to have the team back together. But Maria, please take it away.
Thanks, Barry. Hi, I'm Maria Kavanaugh, and I work in the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences. And I study seascapes. So I use physical and biological data from NASA and NOAA satellites to classify dynamic habitats or seascapes. They're like landscapes, but they move in space and time just as the ocean does. I also study phytoplankton, and these are the photosynthesizing microbes that provide the energy for the rest of the ocean food web. They also affect ocean chemistry. So these phytoplankton are tiny, but they are major and mighty players in ocean health.
Thanks, Maria. George, over to you.
Thanks, Casey. My name is George Waldbusser. I'm an associate professor in the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences, and also the graduate program director for the Ocean, Earth, and Atmospheric Sciences grad program. So my research looks at sort of a range of coastal environmental impacts and sort of thinking about the organisms that fit into those environments, and specifically this problem of what we know as ocean acidification. So you see here some examples looking at shellfish larvae or oyster larvae here on your screen. The sort of larvae on the right, those are about the diameter of your hair, has been impacted by ocean acidification. We've been doing work on shrimp, pink shrimp off the Oregon coast, which is been certified, was the first certified sustainable fishery by the Marine Stewardship Council. And then finally, just thinking about these interactions more broadly, on the right of your screen, you can see pictures of oysters that were grown either inside or outside of seagrass beds, with the upper one being the oysters grown on the inside of the seagrass bed. So sort of acknowledging and recognizing these important interactions across habitats and for organism health. And it ties in because these are food for us to eat. And so having healthy, sustainable food sources is really critical for our own health in the long run.
Thanks, George. Looking forward to hearing a little bit more about your work with shellfish. Perry, last but certainly not least.
Thanks, Casey. So my name is Perry Hystad. I'm an associate professor in the College of Public Health and Human Sciences. I'm an environmental epidemiologist, so I study how environmental factors influence human health and well-being. I think we all have heard enough about epidemiology these days, but I promise I'm a different type of epidemiologist, and I won't talk about COVID-19. So what I'm showing here is when we look at the top left, when we look at the trajectory of human health from the 1950s till now, humans have never been so healthy. So if we look at the massive gains in life expectancy, poverty, child mortality, you can see that these are steadily becoming better. These do mask very large inequalities within and between countries, but overall things have gotten much better over the last 70 years. On the flip side of this, when we look at the bottom graphs there, these are showing indicators of the planet's health. So for example, carbon dioxide emissions, ocean acidification, energy use, all of these show the opposite trajectory. So very simply, a lot of the gains in human health have been achieved by exploiting the planet. So this has led to a relatively new discipline that's emerged over the last decade called planetary health, which explicitly tries to link the health of humans to the natural systems that we depend on. So this seems very obvious, but it's also very challenging to study given the large geographical and temporal scales of natural system change. So at OSU, I lead the Spatial Health Lab, and so we conduct a range of research that looks at linking health and place, specifically environmental conditions that shape human health and wellness. So for example, air pollution, built environments, and climate-related exposures.
Thanks, Perry. Appreciate it. All right, guys, let's get into tonight's discussion. First, I'm going to come to Maria, then George, then Perry on this. For many of us with the perspective of being from the outside looking in, the work you all are involved in seems really large and pretty overwhelming. How do you distill the work and research that you do down to a specific focus? Maria, to you.
Sure. I study the diversity and functioning of phytoplankton. Like I said, these tiny microbes that are in the base of the ocean food chains. And I do this at multiple scales. At the very local scale, the instrument and experiments that I use sip the water, and they're able to tell me kind of who's there and maybe a little bit about what they're doing. And then I use the satellites to look at broad patches of vegetation in the ocean and how they might be moving in time. And that tells me a little bit about the organisms that might need to feed or forage in around them, and where they might be going and why. Satellites can see the surface of the ocean at scales of hundreds of meters to entire oceans in a single day. They're a really great way sorry, my video was off. They're a really great way for us to determine how the oceans are changing through time.
Excellent. George, how about yourself?
Sure. So I work in estuaries, and I think a lot about how the organisms that live there experience the environment. And so one particular way we've been thinking about this quite a bit is sort of thinking about the carbonate chemistry weather that organisms experience. So the tools that we use to do some of these different research endeavors range from laboratory experiments where we control things very carefully, to modeling work where we sort of take what we know from the environment and project forward or backwards how things may change, and also field observations. So we have work in places like Yaquina Bay, where for the last 2 years now, we've been measuring the rates at which shells dissolve in the environment through different parts of the estuary. And so the combination of those things help us to develop a better picture and understanding of the dynamics in the environment and how organisms might experience those dynamics through time.
Yeah, you know, and this is interesting because as I go over to Perry, you know, with the health impacts, you know, all three of you, your work seems to be very separate, but also is also very connected. And Perry, for you and the health impacts, I mean, especially now, things are really large and overwhelming. So how do you distill it all down?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the challenges. So to study and try to figure out how different environmental factors influence human health, we really need lots of people in these studies. And so I'm talking thousands to tens of millions of people if we really want to understand, for example, air pollution, which has a low risk factor, but affects everybody. So the challenge is really getting good estimates of environmental exposure for that many people. And the goal of this research is really to inform policies and prevention options that can be implemented to improve individuals' health. And so in the end, I think health can be viewed a little bit easier than some of the environmental factors, where health is measured at the individual level and people can relate to things that they've experienced through their lives in terms of different environmental exposures or different diseases that they've had. But it does require this very large population to study these type of effects.
Which probably would take quite a bit of time, I imagine, as well in the work that you're doing.
A lot of time or a lot of creative uses of existing data. And so that's something that we have a lot of these days. So we can leverage that data to do some of these studies from hospital admission records, for example, where we might not have to go out and actually collect data from everybody, but we can use stuff that already exists.
I see. Let's talk a little bit about the scale of impact related to tonight's topic, and then the work that you do related to that, from the individual to the city to the region to the globe, all the way across the board. I know some of your guys' work is done at a very micro level, some of a very macro level. You know, George, you have mentioned to me in the past that it is a global problem that manifests locally. Tell me a little bit more what you mean by that.
Yeah, you know, I think one of the challenging things with understanding climate change impacts and how they affect marine ecosystems and estuaries is that the change that we see globally or that we can measure globally is really hard to experience. And so being able to sort of note what a 30% decrease or increase in the acidity of the ocean is nearly imperceivable to any of us. We're able to measure these things over time, but all these climate change impacts, ocean acidification, global warming, impact sort of local dynamics. And that's where things like the estuaries really come into play, or what's happening in those systems. And so this is one of the challenges with sort of understanding these impacts, is that the sort of gradual change manifests in very different ways that we can either measure or experience more locally. One great example of this is some work a former student of mine did, Steve Picella, who looked at how the kind of conditions, the high frequency changes in the chemistry in an estuary changes over time by modeling. And so what happened is the average condition in that system sort of changes the same way we expect it to globally, but the extremes, and so like the extreme carbonate chemistry weather, as I like to think about it, changed at twice the rate. So the bad conditions got worse twice as fast as the average condition, for example. And so that's where these sort of local manifestations really come into play, is understanding how the impacts manifest to what organisms experience themselves or in population dynamic time over the course of a few years.
Maria, how about for yourself, about the scale of impact and the work that you're doing?
Well, at local to regional scales, phytoplankton can impact human health in a good way by fueling food production, fisheries, rich fisheries like we have off of our coast. They can also do this in a negative way, in that some species, when they bloom, can actually be toxic or harmful to humans or some of the other species that might eat the organisms that have accumulated these toxins. At regional to, say, global scales, phytoplankton are important, I would say, for modulating the health of the planet, because they're one of the first steps in drawing down atmospheric CO2 into the ocean and then sinking it away to deeper waters so that it doesn't interact with the atmosphere on longer time scales. And so some of the work that I do on the global scale using the NASA and NOAA satellites looks to see the functioning that we might measure at a single point and expands that to the entire globe by using the imagery and making inferences from the Earth imagery and linking it to how phytoplankton and are cycling carbon throughout the globe.
Is there anything that you've been seeing from the last year, a couple years, that is startling or very differential from previous times?
Well, certainly in the last, I would say in the last year or so, we've seen a resurgence of the ocean marine heat wave. And during these times, the ocean just behaves differently. The water is much warmer. And we expect that we are going to see declines in changes in the size structure. For example, organisms, phytoplankton tend to be smaller when things are warmer, and their overall abundances just generally decrease. So how this will affect ecosystems in the next few years is still, still to be determined, but we've seen already impacts to, say, the cod fishery in the Gulf of Alaska, in part, we think perhaps in part because of lack of food.
Okay, thank you, appreciate that. How about with you, Perry, scale of impact, some of the things you're seeing globally that is manifesting locally?
Yeah, this is actually, I think, a really interesting question when thinking about environmental epidemiology. And so, like I said, we need these very big study populations to look at these risk factors, but many of these exposures vary substantially over space and time. And so this was very clear in a recent study that I completed where we looked at air pollution and cardiovascular disease, but this was in a global study of 200,000 adults in 21 countries. And we looked at how long-term air pollution, so this was over decades, increased the risk of cardiovascular disease going forward. So we followed these individuals for 9 years. And this study was actually a really good example where in the health field, we need these tools that are being developed by other disciplines, like in the College of Earth, Wind, and Fire, that's just easier to say, where we can't measure air pollution in all these locations, but we can use satellite data to measure air pollution over decades for every location in the world. And so in this study, we found that approximately 14% of all new cardiovascular events were actually attributed to long-term PM2.5 air pollution exposure. And this was really the global view of the air pollution impacts. But when you went and visited these communities, for example, in rural India or Tanzania or Canada, you could just really see how diverse this problem was and how a local solution wasn't possible. So the solutions to this problem were all local, even though we had to use this global study to actually quantify what the problem was. And so we're just starting a similar study where instead of looking at air pollution, we're going to try to quantify climate-related changes in these communities and how these impact human health. And that's just going to be, we're just starting this off. Compared to air pollution, this is just going to be that much more challenging because these pathways are so diverse. So it could be climate change in food insecurity, extreme heat, water shortages, flooding. And so this is where, we have to rely on these tools that are developed in other disciplines where we can apply to these studies to try to quantify some of these natural system changes.
Thanks, Mary. Appreciate it. I want to do a little bit of a deeper dive with each one of you and the work and the research that you do. George, as we've already heard from you a little bit already this evening, your work focuses on shellfish. Why does the health of shellfish matter to us?
Thanks for that. Yeah, that's a great question, Casey. So, I think on several different levels, the health of shellfish really matter to us, and as an indicator of the health of the environment. So, filter feeding bivalves like oysters and mussels, clams, they sort of integrate what happens in the environment. They're feeding on the phytoplankton that Maria studied, and they incorporate that, and they can sort of act as an indicator of ecosystem health in a sense. The shells that they grow can actually record, much like a tree ring, changes in chemistry and conditions in the environment in various ways to give us insights into what they experience. So in some ways, they're really great integrators of ecosystem health on one regard. On another regard, they're really important food. The sort of both for Native American tribes along our coast and all coasts. But if we even go back further than that, there's evidence of the evolution and the sort of migration of humans out of Africa and into North America, that until recently it was thought that the crossing of the Beringia land bridge and into North America, they were hunting bison. But it turns out that what I would say is the smart group split off and went along the coast, and they harvested mussels and shellfish from the coast, and they had a much easier go rather than trying to hunt these large mammals. And so there's evidence now that has in the last 2 decades or so been uncovered along the Oregon coast that shows these shell middens from so there's this long history and connection of humans' connection to shellfish in many ways. And then our current coastal communities rely on these organisms, both in aquaculture and in wild fisheries harvest. The 2 largest fisheries in Oregon are the Dungeness crab and Oregon pink shrimp, which are both shellfish, and the crab fishery in particular has been hit hard by some of the conditions and harmful algal blooms that Maria studied, and having to shut down fisheries until those crabs are safe to eat. And the pink shrimp fishery has had sort of more increasingly sort of changes in production and harvest over the years. And so, for example, the marine heat waves that Maria talked about, we went out this past spring to go collect on a research cruise in March, which was quite fun for my grad students in heavy seas. But we went out to collect pink shrimp larvae, and it turned out we couldn't find any. And my student had actually sort of predicted that based on the fact that we have these much higher water temperatures than we normally have. So on multiple levels, we connect back to shellfish in my mind, and it goes back from our early evolution as humans and reliance on shellfish as a primary food source, all the way to the sort of earliest evidence of jewelry that humans have produced their shells. And everybody loves to walk along the coastline and pick up shells and sort of shell collect. So many levels, I feel like, both as indicators of the environment, but also our connection to the ocean is largely through food. And I know personally, I love to eat most of the things that I study. And so I also appreciate their health as well. So,
George, I always like to try to have action items for our audience. And also, me, a lover of puns. How can we help shellfish by us not being so shellfish?
Right. Yeah. So this problem of climate change is, it feels very unmanageable and bigger than us. But I always come back to the fact that it's our collective actions that have gotten us to this position where we are with carbon emissions. And so each one of us making small decisions about how we do things and pushing our elected officials and policymakers to move towards a more sustainable energy future, it can help us to get to that point where we can be less selfish for our shellfish.
I love it. There's a bumper sticker or a coffee mug there somewhere. Appreciate it. Maria, you've already mentioned a little bit about your work with phytoplankton. And when we've talked, you've talked the good, the bad, and the beautiful. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, well, we've got some images, I think, to share with that. And Des is going to share screen with you. Okay, so the good, the bad, the beautiful. So phytoplankton are these first responders to a changing environment. In the background here, in this slide here, it's an animation of phytoplankton blooms that I look at from sensors in space. So as global conditions change, we look to these phytoplankton as beacons because the timing, magnitude, and composition of blooms are likely going to change with global change. And this, of course, has effects throughout marine ecosystems. So Des, if you want to just advance up. So the good, all right. So plankton are tiny single-celled photosynthesizers. They fuel the rest of the ocean food chain, like I said before, leading to rich fisheries like we have off of our coast. But because of photosynthesis and decomposition, they are also tightly linked to the ocean carbon cycle and also patterns of ocean acidification and hypoxia that my biogeochemist colleagues like George study. And here's the bad. Some species of plankton or phytoplankton are toxic. Each one of these species shown here are monitored by groups like NOAA and the Oregon Department of Fisheries and Wildlife because they can release toxins or affect fisheries in a way that can impact human health and well-being. For example, Pseudonychia here on the left is a diatom that can sometimes release a neurotoxin called domoic acid that can build up in shellfish and crab and cause amnesiac shellfish poisoning in the organisms, including humans that eat the seafood. Others, like the dinoflagellate dinophyces, can cause diarrheic shellfish poisoning. Alexandrium, another dinoflagellate shown here, produces a saxic toxin which affects muscles and leads to paralysis-like symptoms. Others, like the diatom Catoceras, aren't necessarily toxic, but their glass-like sedae or spines can clog the gills of salmon if they grow abundant or not enough. So monitoring the good and the bad requires integrating technology and strong partnerships. I mentioned that before. I use a lot of satellite data in my research. I also get to use some newer mobile microscopes that sip the water and count and image the plankton within. So what I'm showing you here are data from an imaging flow cytobot, this instrument shown at the top of the slide, that we plumb through in the seawater flow through system of a NOAA vessel to count the plankton in tandem with the zooplankton and fishery surveys. So I'll leave you with the following images. With this newer technology, we were able to see the ocean like we've never seen it before, both from outer space through satellites and in a drop of water. So the beautiful lies also in this diversity of form and function. It can lead to new hypotheses that we can test, which is also beautiful. But the monitoring that we can do also can benefit the health and well-being of the public. So again, that is beautiful and good in of itself.
Appreciate it, Maria. Thank you. Perry, you know, a lot of the discussion we hear surrounding the environment and its ties to health relate to the future effects on us and the planet. However, much of the work that you do focuses on things that are going on currently. I think for a lot of us on the West Coast, the impacts of wildfires over the course of the last 5-10 years is something that's, you know, very forefront for us. But what are some of the examples of this that you're working on, and what are some of the current examples that maybe people don't usually hear about?
Yeah, and I think this narrative is finally changing in terms of when people are thinking about climate change. They're now recognizing that these impacts are happening now. And so these aren't hypothetical changes that are going to happen in 50 or 100 years. These are things that we are experiencing now. And unfortunately, as you mentioned, the fires this summer and fall are really the perfect illustration of these climate-related impacts that are happening. And so these were by far the largest and most intense fires on record in Oregon. And they also resulted in wildfire smog that I have never experienced before. And this is even going to India and China doing air pollution sampling in rural villages. And so here in Corvallis, it was over 14 days that we were in the unhealthy category. And fortunately and unfortunately, I have air pollution monitoring equipment. So I put some outside my house, some inside my house, and you can see just how bad it is. And that you can't, when the levels are that high, you really can't escape exposures no matter what you do. And so this event, I think, really showed the need for research that examines resilience and susceptibility to these climate-related effects that are happening now and that are going to become more frequent in the future. And so how can we adapt to better handle these events to reduce impacts on human health? And so the first week of the smog, I think I gave over 40 interviews, basically asking the same questions of how do we reduce exposures, who is most vulnerable, and what do these exposures mean for health going forward? And unfortunately, I don't think my answers were very satisfactory because we don't really know what this means for health going forward. We do know that there is a lot of research showing that forest fire smoke triggers respiratory and cardiovascular disease, but very little research has actually followed people forward to see what this very high but short-term exposure means for developing disease. So I think there's a lot of these type of questions that need more research in terms of the impacts of climate change that are going to happen more frequently going forward.
Just a quick follow-up. Is there anything, Perry, that people can do to prepare now for wildfire season coming up in anticipation that it might end up being like it was for quite a long time? I mean, it could vary from year to year, but from type of filtration or things that they can do now to prep themselves for spring, summer, fall, especially for our friends over there at OSU-Cascades in the greater Central Oregon and Eastern Oregon areas.
Yeah, for sure. And I think anyone who tried to make some purchases during this event quickly found that a lot of things were sold out. So I know a lot of people are buying sort of high filtration filters for their furnace, like MERV 12 or higher. N95 masks are effective at reducing exposure, and then also portable HEPA filters. And so these are very effective at cleaning the air in one small room. So if you want to create a semi-clean room, you can put one of these in your room where you sleep. They're not very effective at cleaning a whole house. So if you put one downstairs in a living room, they'll help a little bit, but they just can't clean that much air. So those are three things that I know we have definitely done before next summer, because a lot of those things were sold out. You couldn't get those when these wildfires were happening. Thanks, Barry. Appreciate it.
All right. Earlier this evening, we discussed the scale of impact in terms that it is a global problem that manifests locally. This is the last question of the night before we turn it back over and welcome Nathan and our deans back for the audience Q&A. But let's end tonight with flipping that concept and talk about how local solutions, so like, for instance, maybe the work that's being done at OSU and in each of your work or the work that you know of with global impacts, and how our audience can even get involved. From the importance of the Beaver Caucus to citizen sciences to advocate and support your work. And, Perry, I'm going to pull you back up. What are some ways that global problem manifests locally, and then let's flip it to local solutions?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the research that our lab has been able to do here at OSU actually has had global impact. So we've been able to develop, for example, some global models to predict traffic air pollution, and these are now being used by the Global Burden of Disease Initiative to estimate impacts on pediatric asthma and raise awareness of this issue. Our global work on air pollution and CVD was really some of the first to show that this is a major problem in developing countries. And so up to now, a lot of the research really just focused on developed countries. And more locally, I think we are providing new evidence for how to design cities and communities to promote human health and sustainability. And we're developing new methods that leverage new data sets that haven't really been used in this field yet. And so we're applying Google Street View images and deep learning methods, time activity data to estimate personal environmental exposures, applying these to twin cohorts to control for genetics and early life exposures. So I think there's a lot of work that we're doing that's going to have an impact in this field. And then just more locally, I think OSU has several strengths and is well positioned in this planetary and human health field to make a real impact. So I think OSU is a sea, space, sun, land.
Yep, you got all four. You got them. Yeah, absolutely.
I don't know. But this really gives us amazing resources to measure natural system change. And so combining that capability with human health research is really unique. And then you add in the capabilities of extension, for example, where we can actually leave the office, leave the lab, and go into communities. And so I think all of those things offer a lot of potential for OSU making a big impact in this area.
And I'm glad you mentioned OSU Extension, because some people know, but some others might not know that OSU is in every county thanks to OSU Extension. It's truly a real statewide university with statewide reach, and every county in Oregon, the OSU Extension is there, and having them work so closely with the College of Public Health and Human Sciences and other colleges is a great way to really see where local impacts are made through OSU. George, how about yourself? What are some local solutions that you are seeing with the work that you're doing and around that have potential for global impacts?
Yeah, so I think one of the most fulfilling things I've had a chance to work on here has been working with the oyster industry in mitigating and adapting to ocean acidification. And so close collaborator of mine, Burke Hales, who's also in the College of Earth, Ocean, Atmospheric Sciences, and myself have worked really tightly with oyster hatcheries here in Oregon and other states, and developing protocols, techniques for doing things like buffering water and adjusting the chemistry of the water so that larvae can survive and hatcheries can produce seed for oyster growers. And we've had the fortunate experience of traveling into many different parts of the world to talk to the oyster industry. I've been in Chile, in France, in New Zealand. I currently serve on an international advisory panel for a program in New Zealand, in fact. So we've taken these lessons that we've learned here on a very local scale, and many of these things are being implemented across the globe at this point. So that's been a really satisfying application of work, despite what often seems like esoteric work that we do sometimes in our laboratories. I think the thing that people can really contribute most to, in my mind, in many ways at this point, is acknowledging and recognizing the value that public universities have. And Perry mentioned the extension services and Sea Grant, and these are all things that cost money to do. And I think that the economic return on investments in public education are just completely undervalued. And just sort of, we look at the money that the states and the federal government has put into higher education. Whenever we have these recessions that we've had now, a few of them over the last couple of decades, we never really seem to recover to the funding levels that were prevalent before these. And so my biggest concern coming out of where we are now is whether or not we'll ever recover, state funding. And so advocating our elected officials to make sure that they recognize how important the work that we do is and how it needs to be subsidized to make it affordable to do. And so I think that's really a critical component these days, because our resources are spread thin, but every single assessment that you look at in terms of the return on investment for research, and particularly in a university such as OSU, where so much of that is extended out through those extension services and with stakeholders, is really critical to make sure we don't lose sight of that.
And I'm sure that there are a number of different times where, George, you don't really foresee, sometimes the partnerships that will come down the line, but being able to have the kind of funding with the research that you do might have, a ripple effect, not only just throughout, the university and the work that you're doing, but across many different communities.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And again, sometimes we don't even understand what the impacts of the research will be until we're in it or after it's been done. And that, again, the numbers that economists banter around is something like, $10 to $15 of economic return on every dollar invested in basic research. And I think, if you're investing, how could you go wrong with something like that? That beats Warren Buffett any day. So
I like it. Thanks, George. Maria, from your perspective, local solutions with global impacts.
Yeah. So a couple of things. George mentioned this cruise that he was on in March, and basically due to the global pandemic, that was I think the last cruise that anyone in our college was able to go on until I would say September, when we were able to get out finally again under very controlled conditions, because of controlling for the pandemic. During this time, researchers all over, all of my colleagues, my network of colleagues up and down the West Coast, in Alaska, in Florida, in Maine, all of them were basically, they stopped, the research stopped, except for those who had a strong citizen science network. And these were people who either walked the beaches and sampled from the shore, or perhaps they were fishermen and a scientist, they were friends with a scientist, and the scientist would send out some stuff, some sampling gear out with the fishermen or with the people walking the beach, and the science continued. So Oregon State has a strong community, and I think we, going forward, we should not forget about the power of citizen science. I think this is a great way that the OSU community, the broader OSU community, can become engaged and do work locally that can actually have huge impacts to the food security in the marine environment, but also in terms of, global carbon cycles, monitoring that. So I'm really excited to see what our volunteer and citizen science force can bring to us in the future.
Now, Marie, when you're talking about cruises, you're not hanging out.
No shuffleboard, not yet. But we did on the last one. We did have a mean game of cornhole.
Oh, I like it.
Yeah, it's a little difficult with the waves, but it's still it adds a twist.
How big is the ship? Just out of straight curiosity.
It's just I want to say it's like 220 feet long. Yeah.
Oh, and about how many people are usually out?
So usually on these cruises, we'll have a science crew of about 20 or so. This one was about cut in half, just so that we could maintain social distancing. So our workload was raised, but we got to go out to sea, which was amazing. For part of the time, we were underneath the smoke, but we got to see clear skies probably before anyone in Oregon got to.
Excellent. Perry, George, Maria, thank you very much. I want to welcome Nathan back, as well as our deans, so we can get to the your guys' questions in the audience here, so we can make sure that we get as many of them answered. But really, Perry, George, Maria, thank you very much for your presentation. Nathan, I'm sure we have a plethora of different kind of questions out there, so let's get right to it.
We do. And I have to say again, first of all, for all of our viewers, a big thanks again to all of our panelists. Again, I'll probably be thanking you again at the end. If you have questions, if you haven't submitted anything yet, definitely pop that into the live stream and YouTube if you've got an account, or send it to menti.com, event code 3597977. I'm laughing a little bit because I always love when people make comments in Mentimeter that aren't necessarily questions, but they are critiques on your presentations. But good things came through this time, guys, because the first comment that came through is there any way to incorporate more puns into this talk in the future? Because I endorse that completely. So Casey, A+ on that one. Hey, guys, we got to think about getting the pun game up.
And George humors me, which I really appreciate.
So yeah, we definitely have some more some questions in here. Everybody, please go ahead and continue to submit as we go along. The first one up is, and again, because our viewers are kind of coming in at different points, so I may ask some questions that you guys have hit on a little bit, but want to talk a little bit more about 2020 and some of the challenges that maybe it's created that you guys haven't talked a lot, where you've had to pivot in your, either in your research or ways in which you've had to get maybe a little bit more creative or innovative in what you guys do. So I guess it's kind of an open question to everybody.
Who wants to go first? Come on.
I can start off a little bit. So in our lab, we do a lot of computational work, as well as counting and some experimental work. Generally, the students start off with some of the more straightforward work and then move up to the computational work. we've had to expedite and improve how, basically improve the access of students to that computational work. And it's involved spending a lot more time on Zoom and helping students troubleshoot their code, helping them learn a new computer language, whereas normally they would be sitting in the lab counting stuff with you on the microscope. It's made the sense of community within our lab groups very different. It has to be much more intentional. And so some of that is really good, right? So we're very much more intentional about connecting, and we're creating capacity, whereas before, maybe, in terms of the computational skills of students, whereas maybe before we wouldn't have done that necessarily so rapidly.
Yeah, I can talk from the health side. I mean, I think there's both been challenges and new opportunities, and Javier can talk more about the TRACE study that's being led by our college to actually do surveillance of COVID-19. For ongoing studies, anything that had actual data collection in person has been pretty much halted. A lot of the stuff I do is based on administrative data as well, so those studies are able to keep going. And there's also been some opportunities to actually look at how the environment influences factors that have been a result of COVID-19. So mental health is a major issue that people are worried about. And we recently got funded to look at how different environmental factors, for example, how often you're outside in nature, how might that buffer against the stress that's associated with the lockdown in the spring, and everything that's happened since then. So both challenges and opportunities, I think.
I'll just quickly add that, yeah, we've had to curtail some of our field work. I like to tell people that being an oceanographer, I actually did most of my work from a car. So most of my work is sort of tide flats and sort of shallow systems. So we've tried to exploit that where we can as a lab group. And, and there's been some paperwork and things we have to do to get approvals for some of that, and changes in how we do things that have become less efficient. And, the labs, we have capacities now. We can't have as many people in there at a time, and everything's just slower. And I agree 100% with Maria. The dynamic is much more challenging in many ways. Normally I'd be sitting across the hallway from my lab, and if there's a problem in the lab, student can come over and just knock on the door and we can resolve it really quickly. And now it becomes a planning exercise and when I can get in there and deal with things. But surprisingly, it's easy. The way we do research often is socially distanced in itself, and so it maybe hasn't been as impacted as our educational mission in many ways, having to do all that remotely.
Thanks, George. Nathan, what else we got out there?
So
yeah, and I'll just, Javier, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, sorry. As Perry said, yes, everything has been pivoting these last few months. Perry said he's not an infectious disease epidemiologist, an environmental epidemiologist. My expertise has been in epidemiology of chronic disease, but all of a sudden in the last few months, I have to become start working on this epidemic and control of this epidemic. I've been blessed with the opportunity to collaborate with colleagues across 5 colleges at OSU, the College of Science, College of BedMed, the College of Engineering, and the College of Agricultural Sciences, and our college, Public Health and Human Sciences, on the development of this TRACE project to monitor community prevalence in COVID in communities in Oregon as outbreaks were occurring. And that's been an incredibly interesting project, but also everything in public health, in learning how to address this epidemic on the fly, and all the challenges, not just the infection itself, but also how to encourage the proper behaviors and people to follow the measures, the wear masking, the masking wearing, the social distancing, the avoiding large groups gatherings, etc. The challenges that's been posing on on everybody in the public health community, given unfortunately the fact that this becomes like such a political issue. And now the challenges we're going to be facing with the vaccines coming up. And for one hand, and on the one hand, we're going to have people perhaps thinking that because there is a vaccine, we no longer need to follow proper containment measures. And on the other hand, people not wanting to be vaccinated because they don't trust the vaccine. So a lot of very, very challenging work ahead to try to get everybody and the society back to normal.
Roberta, I want to make sure if you want to chime in on anything before we get to the next question, you have the opportunity for sure.
Sure. I'll just note that there have been slowdowns in the number of areas and interactions that have been made much more difficult. And I think I would point mostly to the fundamental way our relationships and interactions have changed, not only for the impact of what we can get done in the now, but for what we might get done in the future. Maria mentioned that our interactions have to be more intentional, which is true, but there is a serendipity to casual conversation that leads sometimes to breakthrough science that isn't occurring right now because people are not having those impromptu conversations that generate new ideas and new excitement. And so in addition to a slowdown of current work, I think the generation of new ideas is probably suffering a little bit right now.
Yeah, it's certainly unfortunate. Hopefully, that's something that, we can reverse the trend going back forward. Nathan, what do we got?
Next up, now they're starting to come in. Good questions, everybody. The one that's come up is, what are the most significant federal policy questions regarding environmental health? That's probably a very, very, very broad question, but I guess maybe particular to everybody. What are some things that you're kind of spotlighting right now?
Is anybody who wants to raise their hand and take that one, or?
I mean, I can jump in at the start here. I mean, I think the whole issue of how do you regulate carbon emissions and climate forcing agents is one that is getting a lot of attention once we switched from an Obama administration to a Trump administration. And so how do you regulate CO2 when it's not directly in the Clean Air Act as a criteria air pollutant? But right now that seems like the most feasible way of actually addressing those emissions. So it'll be interesting to see how this evolves. But I think this comes back to a lot of this, especially over the last 4 years, is occurring locally. And so what this might have demonstrated is that we can't wait for a top-down solution. A lot of this is going to happen bottom-up. And so starting in communities and cities and states, that's really where we're seeing a lot of change. And Oregon is at the forefront of a lot of that, with cap and trade that's going to be starting soon, and some of the clean energy initiatives that are coming out of Portland, where that money that is available now is being managed by communities of color and has to be spent in communities of color to address energy, health, climate-related issues.
Is there anybody else who wants to chime in, or we can move on to the next question? All right, I think moving on. Nathan, what do we got next?
All right, so next one up, maybe again a little bit more health directed on this one, but question is, am I correct in thinking that Obamacare mandated electronic medical records? Was this mandate good for research?
I'm definitely not the expert on electronic medical records. I mean, I think that is still based on the insurer. And so if the insurer, I mean, all insurers are going to be using electronic medical records. It's just how available those are for research. I mean, just for efficiency, that's what everyone's using now, but it's getting access to those for research purposes where it can be more challenging.
Okay, excellent. And one thing I noticed too is I think whenever you talk about interdisciplinary partnerships, like I love that concept, because I think we feel like sometimes in our particular case at OSU, are people being siloed in the research. I don't see that with what you guys do. I don't see that with a lot of what other colleges do, but can you talk a little bit about that importance of that interdisciplinary effort to connect the dots between topics just like environmental change and consequences for human health.
Yeah, I guess I can jump in there. I mean, we can make all the measurements we want of the environment, but if there isn't somebody to translate that to what that means, I think that's really where one of the strengths, I believe, of OSU is. And I've had some great projects with folks in economics and geography, you know, and trying to take what we do with the natural science and apply it and think about economic impacts of and economic costs of adaptation to climate change, for example, for aquaculture and oyster industry. So, you know, I think the quote that comes, you know, it's just some of this can die in the dark if we don't make those connections. And, you know, the research is often really further ahead than what the public is often exposed to. And so, you know, the interdisciplinary nature and making those connections, but then also the communication of that is really important as well, I think, in moving it forward and making it applicable. So,
Roberta, I know you want to chime in there as well, but you're still muted, so.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, a number of people tend to think of universities as being the ivory tower with silos. And I think OSU is unusual in the sense that there are colleges, but there are really very few barriers to collaborating across colleges. Within our own college, we don't have departments. We have what I call disciplinary caucuses almost, and faculty are free to associate with multiple groups as a function of their interests. Obviously, they have to have some fidelity to that group, but we're very flat and we're very collegial. And I think OSU really supports that kind of structure. And there's a lot of work that goes on across the campus. And within Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences, public health, agricultural sciences, forestry, there are people who work across all of these ecosystems, if you will, to collaborate with one another and do work that's really relevant for all of our health. So OSU, I think, is outstanding in that regard, and it wouldn't surprise me if other universities also support that kind of work.
And also, just to follow up on that, I couldn't agree more with Roberta. That's been my experience in the 4 years I've been here. But also, George was talking about the translation, how to bring out to the communities and the population the research and the findings of our research. And that's where the implementation science and the dissemination science is also so important. And at Oregon State, we have the great resource of OSU Extension in all counties of the state that can help us to disseminate and to translate the research funding to the benefit of the community and people.
Thanks, Javier. Nathan.
Well, that's great. And actually, something that's been mentioned a couple different times is, I think, the breadth of kind of spread that OSU kind of has in the state. Javier just talked a little bit about like county to county. One of the things that was brought up earlier was around this concept of citizen science, which I think is not familiar with many people. The particular question that came in is, are there any projects going on maybe locally in Central Oregon that this potential viewer could help with? Or maybe, and I'll kind of say even beyond, because I know there's a couple things I know around like snow-based measurements and some things like that, that because they're done electronically, I mean, you could almost be located in regionally in different areas to help with specific pieces of research. So is there anything maybe going on that could be local to Central Oregon or maybe, broader that they can still participate with?
Yeah, I know from one thing that came out of the wildfires is that there were a lot of communities that really didn't have any monitoring. And so Extension was very keen to use low-cost monitors. So they're called purple air monitors. They're around $250 or $300, and getting people to set those up at their home or in schools, or different locations where there might not be measurements, but where there might be people that are exposed. And so that's a good example of where if there were people willing to set those up at their houses, that's more measurements that we can use to inform people what those levels are and act on them.
And so I guess just a follow up on that one. I mean, what's the best direction if folks are interested in finding out more about this project? Is it maybe contacting each of the colleges independently if it's an area of interest that they have, or do we have some sort of a place that they can go to, I guess, to find out more about ways that they can help?
I mean, that's a great question. And I don't think that resource actually exists in terms of a one-stop shop for people interested in collaborating with research, but that's a really good idea. I think, because there's a lot of other projects too.
We actually have a one-stop shop at the college. For we have the OSU Center for Health Innovation.
Yes.
That is was precisely created for that purpose. To connect research, not only in our college, this is a university-wide center, but on health-related matters, to connect the university capacity and research capacity with communities, with nonprofits, with businesses, with public health agencies, to find ways to partner and to support those communities. So that is the OSU Center for Health Innovation. But I'm sure there will be other mechanisms. Of course, you can also contact colleges individually or researchers individually.
Excellent. And then another question, and Maria, I think this one is maybe going to go specifically to you. So in a lot of what this person has researched, that ocean is the biggest determinant of climate change. What are the most critical issues involving our oceans today?
Well, I would say heating up. Well, there's a famous paper. It's heating up, getting losing breath and going sour, right? So we've got the temperature the effects, and then the increase, or perhaps increasing in terms of their frequency of these heat wave events. And so this is an indication that things are changing. We're experiencing a new normal. We've got things that George studies, where the ocean is so efficient at taking up CO2 that in some spaces, it can interact with the regional chemistry also, but in some spaces the water is becoming corrosive to the shellfish that are in there. And then we've got things where key habitat determinants, like things like sea ice in the Arctic, for example, is just going, right? We're losing it. And so that's key habitat for a certain species, which means that, the krill or the organisms that are relying on that ice in terms of like krill in the Antarctic, but that they don't have that habitat on which to live or to make their living. And then last, it's an issue of food security. So there is a rise, and we're throwing all the data we can at it, but we think that there is a rise in the occurrence and the severity of these harmful algal blooms. And this is something that is not just kind of esoteric. There is actually a death in Alaska just this past late summer, where a person actually consumed shellfish and made it into the died from their symptoms because they were exposed to Alexandrium. And so I think we have, the climate issue, but we also have more and more these local issues that are actually affecting human health directly.
Excellent. Anybody else on that one, or move to the next question, Casey?
I would just add, Maria covered it well, but and Perry said this earlier, but these are not things that are decades away. They're now, and I think that's the thing that can't be stated strongly enough, is that the effects are happening now. The impacts on aquaculture or in the West Coast shellfish industry were, in the last 10 years, within the last 10 years. These are all things that are current now. I haven't dug into the paper. There was just something that came out recently noting that if we curtailed all emissions right now, we've already passed one tipping point, at least for global climate. So every year it becomes more imperative that we address this issue and cut emissions. And all these things kind of feed into each other. And that's really been the drive of a lot of the funding these days, is multi-stressor experiments and understanding of how temperature and oxygen and pH and fisheries and invasive species all intersect and collide to sometimes create conditions that are far worse than any one of those things by themselves.
And you know what, actually, so George, I'm gonna go off of that because it's definitely related to this next question that was asked, and I'm gonna give it an additional part too. The question from the audience member is a lot of the associated issues that you're all speaking about tonight. So I'm going to assume that the viewer is talking about things like climate change or any of the topics that we've been speaking of. Do you think they're being fairly treated by public media? And I guess my secondary question to that is, how can we do a better job of educating the public around things like the research that you guys are doing?
Yeah, I mean, that's so whether the media treats it fairly, I mean, that's a really, really tough question. The way the media makes money is to get people to click headlines. And I sort of argue with people about this a bit, is that we got the media that basically we deserve in some ways, because we all sort of are programmed to look for those outrageous things, right? So part of it is our own sort of, we can push back against those types of headlines if they're not substantiated or supported in some way. But I will note that, in many cases, our predictions as scientists have, when you go back 10 years or 20 years, and there are predictions about what Arctic sea ice might look like, now versus what it was forecasted to be like now in the year 2000. The science in many cases has always been actually conservative in terms of it has actually underpredicted a lot of these events and effects that we're seeing now. So, there's this tension, that I know that I often feel in sort of talking with media about some of the work we do, because there's often an attempt and a need in some ways to try to distill these complicated issues down to something simple. So, I guess I wouldn't damn all the media. I mean, many of the science writers that I've talked to are really good, hardworking journalists, and in many ways the same sort of budgetary constraints that we have, they have. I mean, many of them are they're no longer hired as full-time journalists at places, and they're trying to do this on a per diem basis, and so they're writing 6 different articles at a time, and there's maybe one person who does all of science, and so they would cover everything that Perry, Marie, and I did, as well as everything science-wise that comes out. So it's really tough, because I think that many of them that are really trying to do the right thing are in a tough spot. And then I think I forgot the second part of the question, Nathan.
How people can get involved.
In what way?
Well, I think if I can, George, if I can go to a little bit more,
Yeah.
One thing that I've noticed is, like you just talked about, it's taking this complicated set of, well, the research, the complicated set of factors, and being able to distill that down to a workable, understandable piece for the lay, that have no background in anything that we've talked about tonight, because you've already expressed, it sounds like collectively as a group, like these things are really, really important, and we need to start taking a lot of this more seriously. How do we get them to that point of there not being that disconnect?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that is a struggle is, right, science is never entirely 100% certain, right? And this tension between the sort of 95% certainty we know and the 5% uncertainty. And what we tend to do as scientists is work in the 5% uncertainty, because that's where the interesting questions are. And we don't often transition well to talking about our 95% certainty around these issues. And the public, I think often, you know, from an outside perspective, it's hard to appreciate the fact that we all live with this certainty that all of our ideas are based on building this platform of evidence over time. And, you know, largely what we can't do are things like say, you know, whether or not we're going to exactly have a forest fire in this part of Oregon next year on September or whatever, right? But we can say the frequency, magnitude, and duration of those sorts of events are forecast to get worse. And next year it may not be bad. And the year after that, it may not be bad. But if you sort of, you know, integrate that over time, all these things are going to get worse, whether it's on land or the ocean. So I think that evidence is there. It's just that what happens with, my experience has been with policymakers and elected officials is that it's harder to sort of have that vision of a decade or two out because it's not the election cycle that they're sort of faced with, right? So I think that's part of the challenge is that we can't say with certainty that, you know, I would never say that oysters are going to go extinct from this. I mean, I just don't think that's ever going to happen. But the way we have to do things is going to change, and our ability to do things and the cost of doing things are going to get more expensive. And so I think that's the sort of challenge. But we all want certainty in the cost of inaction on these things are going to cost a lot more in the long run than the cost of action.
Can I jump in? I totally agree with everything that George said. I just wanted to kind of highlight the fact that we're in this kind of unique position at OSU in which we can bring this cutting edge research and complex research and complex ideas every day into a classroom and teach science communication and complexity to students. And this comes at this kind of dance of like us being a research university, but also having an education mission. And so I think in terms of what, I mean, if this is something that is of value, I think to the community at large, this balance between the research mission and, you know, being able to train the next generation of journalists, you know, the next generation of politicians to be smart in terms of their scientific thinking, then it's you know, it's being close to the new research. I think that allows us to do this.
And what I'll do is we'll probably end up on this question. Is there anybody else from the panel that maybe wants to add anything else to the excellent points that have just been made?
I would just say it was interesting to see how the wildfires were actually covered this summer. And it's only been the last couple of years where it was actually covered that there is a clear connection to climate change in terms of why we're seeing this increased intensity, frequency, and impact of these fires. 5 years ago, I think journalists would have been very hesitant to make that link. And now that's becoming more common as people start to accept and become more familiar with this science.
Yep. Great point. Great point. Okay. All right. Well, everybody, we kind of come at that time for the show this evening. There were definitely some questions that did not get answered. So I want to make sure that folks have that opportunity so we can email you back directly. Again, if you contact us through events@osucascades.edu, we will make sure that your questions get answered from our awesome panelists tonight. Casey, kind of before I do my conclusion, is there anything you want to do as some parting words?
You know, I want to thank again each one of our panelists and our two deans this evening. You know, this group got together once before, and it really is just a lot of fun to be able to kind of bring this level of expertise. And you know, I would encourage people, whether it's, you know, the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences or the College of Public Health and Human Sciences, really, you know, the websites that are available, you know, have a really big build out. You know, there's a lot of resources to be found there, from the research that's being done to the contacts from, you know, each and every one of them. You know, what Javier was talking about with the OSU Center for Health Innovation, you know, that's online. There's a lot of resources for people. You know, they've come a long way from being, you know, very clunky in the 90s university websites. They're pretty sleek now. So I really would encourage people to go and to learn more that way, because that's a great way to try to get in touch with people, whether you want to do a citizen science or really just kind of know more what's going on.
And I will say, part of my main job, besides apparently becoming a YouTuber in COVID, is connecting our community members, especially those of us in Central Oregon that are associated with OSU-Cascades and beyond. If you all have questions that need answered or want resources, definitely reach out. So kind of in conclusion, everybody, again, I'd like to say thank you all for our audience members for participating tonight. Definitely thanks to Oregon State University Alumni Association for kind of co-hosting with us for this Science Pub for the end of November. Big shout out to OSU's College of Public Health and Human Sciences and the College of Earth, Ocean, Atmospheric Sciences, and then OSU-Cascades, of course. And specifically, again, like Casey just did, to our panelists tonight. And again, those of you that don't know, our production is being done by an intern program that's run through our Innovation Collab here on campus by students. So it's kind of a unique learning opportunity as well. We talk about ways of getting involved. This is one thing we do. So a huge shout out again to our partners with Connect Central Oregon. It seems like every single week we try something a little bit different that we're adding to our presentation. So I can't wait to see what this looks like in the next couple of months. Couple reminders before we head out is, first of all, again, I want to bring up the Beaver Caucus. We're always looking for advocates for Beaver Nation. It's incredibly important to OSU's mission and doing whatever we can to support the work of our researchers, faculty, and in the case of OSU Cascades, our continued expansion. So this is the time for those that want to do more than to get involved with the university, and Beaver Caucus is your way to do just that. So definitely check us out there. And then another little piece that's come up too since we've gone virtual is you guys can rewatch any of these science pubs that we put on. So there's a little bit of confusion how people go to it. The easiest thing to do is simply visit us at osukascades.edu/science-pubs or finding us at our YouTube channel that you guys were at tonight, searching for OSU Cascades and just scrolling to our past live streams playlist. So feel free to share this out with other folks. We've had some really good attendance lately at these, and definitely folks watching after the event. So again, we talked about, things that our current situation has limited us in our research and things that we do, but this is one of those cool things that we get to do as a university, is have a further reach with our audience. So we thank you for that. I guess on behalf of everybody here tonight, that concludes our Science Pub for Tuesday, November 17th, 2020. Have a fantastic night, and we will see you out there.